So, Earthlings, how's you doing? Welcome to another YouTubey type thing with me, Roger Yates. Thought I'd do a little bit of sociology this time. In particular, something called ethnomethodology, which we used to affectionately call ethno. And I'm not actually quite sure if it's taught much anymore. But when I was at the University of Wales in Bangor, it was kind of like a new thing. It was criticised for being a kind of micro perspective, missing out on the structure, which was a real problem for it. But essentially, it talked about how people kind of achieved the world through interaction. So it looked at things like conversation analysis, turn taking, those kind of things. The way that the work that goes into achieving a kind of normal kind of social interaction, just like a conversation. So it was quite interesting, and in particular, it talked about things like kind of perception and interpretation, hermeneutics, I suppose. And so, if it's kind of like when people are having a conversation, you kind of make sense of what each other are saying, even if you don't necessarily pick up on exactly the meaning of the other person, and also you might impose a meaning. And that's the thing that I want to talk about today, in the sense that one of the classic cases in ethno was this, there's a chapter, and it was entitled something like this: the baby cried, the mummy picked it up, or picked her up, I suppose. And it was about what that sentence was taken to mean by people. And so when you hear the baby cried and the mother picked the baby up, you hear, whether this is true or not, that the baby is the mother's baby and the mother is picking her baby up. This is kind of, in a way, what you hear. So that's so it's to do with the way that we kind of make sense of the world in interaction, in social interaction. And so this is important within a social movement, in the sense that we are claims makers. Sociologists see social movements as claims makers in civil society. So we make claims. We identify a problem, we make claims about them. Our problem that we find is cultural speciesism, and we make claims that other animals are rights bearers, that our use of them are rights violations. These are the claims. Well, that's the claims that the rights advocates would make. And also, in terms of social movement theory, when they look at how social movements recruit, they often make a distinction between, say, networking, which is often associated with, say, the environmental movement, and moral shocks, which would be associated with the animal movement. And so we tend to morally shock the other in order to impress them about the issue that we want to raise and the claims that we want to make about them. And so this is where you get the videos from. Watch Earthlings, watch Dominion, because we want to shock people on a moral level. And we're less inclined and even capable, probably, of just explaining our position. And that feeds into the last video, really, which is the lack of animal rights in animal rights, is that the fact that you kind of have to know a little bit of the case for animal rights in order to explain it, whereas you probably wouldn't if you just want to make cruelty claims, because you assume that people know what cruelty is and that they're opposed to it, that kind of thing. So moral shocks are important. Now, in terms of our claims and in terms of moral shocking people, we do that by using three concepts quite a lot, which are controversial within the movement. So this is what I want to talk about. So I'm thinking about the rape claims, the use of the word Holocaust, and slavery. So all of those things are problematic and controversial within the movement. And we need to think about it in terms of the fact that we are claims makers in civil society. So our audience are society in general. And in some senses, there's no point in putting, the backups of your audience by using the wrong words or using phrases that you might be used to, you might think is completely relevant, and you might think is appropriate and analogous. And in a sense, for the audience point of view, it kind of stops the conversation dead, and it gives them something to focus on rather than what you want to focus on, which is talking about animal rights violations. And so we tend to use the phrase rape to describe artificial insemination. Now, I tend to think there's a lot more going on when one human being sexually attacks another than what goes on in artificial insemination. Artificial insemination is a kind of scientific technique in order to produce an offspring of a particular type for a particular purpose and to be exploited in a particular way. And so they're looking for, a good milker. They're looking for a beef animal, for example, or inverted commas, and so they're producing semen to create these exploitable beings. That's the entire idea of artificial insemination. Now, that's not what goes on in rape, in the sense that actually creating an offspring is often not a concern of the rapist, and whether or not an offspring accrues, as it were, is not the issue, and certainly not in terms of the quality of that product, if you like, use those phrases. And so there are times when rape has been used in war with the aim of creating offspring in order to kind of culturally and psychologically damage the enemy and this kind of stuff. But generally speaking, when one human being rapes another, they're not doing it to produce an exploitable being, which is the very reason for doing artificial insemination. But there are, of course, things that are similar, in the sense that often the victim of the assault is shackled or tied down or restrained in some ways. Obviously, there is anal penetration. There's vaginal penetration in the when the victim is female. And again, that would be another difference, in the sense that human beings will rape male human beings. They don't artificially inseminate males, because there would be no point. And so in terms of other animals, male ones are not artificially inseminated either. So there's a kind of big difference there. So I think there's a heck of a lot more going on when one human sexually attacks another. And in some senses, there's a lot more going on in artificial insemination, because it's to create a particular product in the eyes of the exploiter, an exploitable product, which is not the case in rape. Now, the Holocaust is an interesting example, because I tend to think that the phrase the animal Holocaust is probably okay. But going back to ethno, when you hear the word Holocaust, you hear the Jewish Holocaust or the Holocaust. So culturally, the phrase the Holocaust is associated with the Second World War and what the Nazis did to Jews in particular, but also other groups. And so even if you wanted to carefully say, well, I'm talking about the animal Holocaust here, people are going to hear the Holocaust. So there's a kind of a problem there. Now, obviously, we do have the argument within the movement about, well, some Holocaust survivors are quite happy to use the phrase, Herrschaft and this kind of stuff. So there is that. I just think that in terms of the audience, you're again in danger of derailing the conversation because they're thinking, wow, Holocaust, and there's two problems as well that I can see. First, why do we seem to need to be able to point to some similarity to some exploitation of humans in order to make the point that this exploitation of other animals is morally problematic? Again, do we not have enough confidence that we can make the case for animal rights without saying, well, look, it's just the same as when humans are exploited in similar ways? So in that sense, it's a bit speciesist. And then I think the major problem with the animal Holocaust even is the fact that the Holocaust was about eradicating a population, whereas we create a population in order to exploit them, which the Nazis weren't interested in doing. They were trying to eradicate those they saw as inferiors. They weren't creating those that they saw as inferiors in order to exploit them, like farmers do, for example. So there's a big kind of difference in terms of that. So, Holocaust is not really that accurate a phrase to use in the first place. And then lastly, we got the issue of slavery. Now, obviously, there's an immediate problem for white people to be talking about slavery because, again, you can talk about, I did a talk at my university about modern day slavery, and a lot of modern day slaves and people in bonded labour, etc., are white. But when you hear the word slavery, you think about the transatlantic slave trade. And so again, we're back to the ethno thing about what we kind of hear in our minds, and that immediately creates that problem that if somebody wants to be offended or derail the conversation and go, oh, so you're making a comparison, you're calling black people animals. Now, apart from the fact that that biologically is correct, it's not a good thing to say in terms of moving a conversation on. So there are all kind of problems. Now, again, there are some things that you couldn't make, a positive claim there because, there's no doubt that other animals are enslaved. And so there's not much of a difference between the word enslaved and slavery. But, we have to be careful about our language, in the same sense that, we do have some slogans like, meat is murder. And that invites the question, oh, so you're saying that I'm a murderer? Okay. So that's a more difficult thing to negotiate then. If they're asking you if you're saying that they're a murderer, because it's not a particularly smart thing to say to someone who you're trying to talk to in a kind of positive way about a moral position. You don't get very far by opening up by saying, by the way, you're a murderer, you're a rapist. You're somebody involved in the Holocaust, and you support slavery. So in terms of our claims making, we just need to be careful about the words we want to use. We need to be confident about the fact that we can describe animal use without having to make it comparable to what goes on with humans. And we need to be confident enough that we can make the moral case without resorting to that. And we need to then think about, do we, are we really in the business of shocking people? Because in some ways, when people use those phrases, Holocaust, rape, slavery, they are meaning to shock, aren't they? That's the idea. They're kind of shocking people, Whether in a kind of social interaction sense it kind of works even is what's at issue here, because it seems to me that it's not particularly good, even just on a tactical level. So if we wanted to just think of this in terms of whether it's tactically useful, beneficial to use those words, even though we might think, well, it's totally relevant. I mean, as I said, I don't, but if you think it's totally relevant, then you've got to ask the second question. Okay, but is it still tactically a good idea? And I would submit that it's not. And that we can, actually, I think that by describing animal use and the rights violation that goes on, people in their heads might go, wow, that actually sounds a little bit like rape, or blimey, that's a genocide, that's a Holocaust going on there, look at the numbers, and this kind of stuff. Oh, wow, they are enslaved, we're really talking about animal slaves here. Now, if people say that in their own heads, that's all a good thing, because you're not there imposing that interpretation. They've created that themselves, again, ethno thing, that they would interpret that and think, wow, Now that seems to me to be a pretty good thing. Now, we can do that without using those words ourselves. We can just describe what happens. We can describe the rights violations and how animal use proceeds and the reasons for it, and blah, 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 speciesism and all the rest. So, we're not lacking in descriptions of animal use and rights violations. So we don't really have to set out to shock people by using those words that are kind of designed to do that. Because when you do, you're in real danger, especially if you're on the media, of closing the conversation down or just diverting it down places you don't want to go. Because then you end up spending several moments, minutes even, defending your language use, rather than talking about what you're really there for, which is to talk about animal rights violations and animal use. So, that's what I wanted to say this time. Think about it, Do we want to shock people in that way? Do we want to kind of create that kind of response? Because that might just shut their mind down to what you really want to say. Regardless of whether we think it's a great idea and totally relevant and all that. We have to, we're social animals. We have to take into account the reaction that we're going to get. There's no point in going, well, I'm just going to speak the truth and sod you. In terms of social interaction, that's really naive, and there's no nuance there at all. So we should think very critically about our claims making, especially when it involves moral shocking as well. Okay, folks, see you again next time. Bye for now.